A quiet person can break a room without raising their voice once. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through absence. The most dangerous moment in an empath's life is not when they cry, argue, or finally lose control. It is the moment they stop caring enough to explain themselves. Most people never notice it at first because an empath does not leave loudly. They leave emotionally, slowly, silently, piece by piece. One day the long messages stop, the constant checking stops, the effort disappears, the patience fades. The emotional support that everyone depended on suddenly becomes unavailable, and that is when panic begins. Because people get used to empaths being endlessly available. They expect forgiveness without change, they expect understanding without effort, they expect loyalty without appreciation. But few people realize that even the softest hearts carry limits, and once those limits are crossed too many times, the empath changes in ways most people never expect. Not into a cruel person, not into a cold person, into a careful person. Into someone who finally understands that giving everything away does not guarantee love. One of the lesser-known truths about empaths is that they usually notice toxic behavior very early, much earlier than people think. They see manipulation, they feel disrespect, they recognize emotional distance, but they stay anyway because they keep hoping people will become better. They keep believing their patience can heal broken behavior. That hope becomes their biggest strength and their biggest weakness at the same time. Many empaths spend years carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. They become therapists for friends who never listen back. They become emotional homes for people who disappear the second they are no longer useful. They absorb stress, negativity, guilt, and pain until their own emotional world becomes exhausted. Science and psychology have slowly started recognizing emotional burnout in highly sensitive people, and many experts now believe constant emotional overstimulation can deeply affect mental health, relationships, and even physical energy levels. But the dangerous part is this. Most empaths do not realize they are emotionally drained until they completely disconnect from themselves. They keep functioning, keep helping, keep smiling, keep showing up, while internally they are collapsing in silence, and because they hide pain so well, people assume they can take more. So the cycle continues, more pressure, more sacrifice, more emotional labor, until one day the empath reaches a point where their soul simply gets tired. Not dramatic tiredness, not temporary frustration, deep emotional exhaustion, the kind that changes personality. The kind that makes a once warm person become distant overnight. That transformation confuses people because they were never paying attention to the damage before. They only notice the empath after the giving stops. And that is where this story becomes uncomfortable for many people. Because when an empath finally gets tired of giving, relationships begin revealing their true nature. Some people fight harder for the connection, others disappear instantly. Some become angry because they lost emotional control over someone they depended on. Others suddenly become kind again because they feel the empath slipping away. This is why emotional withdrawal creates more fear than conflict. Anger still shows attachment, silence does not, and the silence of an exhausted empath carries years of disappointment behind it. The truth is, many people only value an empath after access to them disappears, after the support disappears, after the attention disappears, after the emotional safety disappears. By then, it is usually too late. Because once an empath emotionally detaches, returning to the old version of themselves becomes almost impossible. They remember too much, they finally see patterns clearly, they finally understand how often they were used while calling it love. That realization changes everything. In this video, you will learn why empaths give so much even when it hurts them, what slowly destroys them emotionally without anyone noticing, and the silent psychological shift that happens when they finally stop trying to save everyone around them. You will also discover why toxic people become uncomfortable when an empath starts protecting their peace, why emotional burnout changes relationships forever, and why the calmest people often carry the deepest emotional scars. Some of these truths are uncomfortable because they expose hidden dynamics inside friendships, families, and relationships that most people ignore. You will see how overgiving slowly rewires the empath's behavior, why silence becomes their strongest form of self-protection, and how their emotional withdrawal can completely change the people around them. Most importantly, you will understand the difference between a kind person and an emotionally exhausted one because they may look similar on the outside while internally becoming completely different. There is also a hidden reason why many empaths struggle to walk away even after repeated disrespect. And once you understand it, many human relationships begin making much more sense. The ending of this video matters because the final stage of an empath's transformation is the stage almost nobody talks about. It is the stage where they stop seeking validation, stop chasing closure, stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. That phase changes their entire energy, and the people around them feel it immediately. Some admire it, some fear it, some regret losing access to the version of the empath that gave endlessly without limits. By the end of this video, many behaviors that once confused you will suddenly become clear. The silent distancing, the emotional numbness, the unexpected detachment, the sudden boundaries, none of it happens randomly. There are emotional reasons behind every stage, and once you see the full picture, you cannot unsee it, because the empath's silence is never empty. It is built from every moment they stayed quiet to keep peace, every moment they ignored their own pain to comfort others, every moment they accepted less than they deserved just to avoid hurting people they cared about. Eventually, even the kindest soul reaches a point where survival becomes more important than sacrifice. That is the moment everything changes, and most people never see it coming because they were too busy benefiting from the empath's kindness to notice the exhaustion growing underneath it. The most shocking part is that many empaths themselves do not realize how deeply drained they are until they stop feeling emotionally connected to people they once would have done anything for. That emotional numbness scares them at first. They wonder why they no longer react the same way. Why conversations feel empty, why they suddenly crave distance more than connection. But the answer is deeper than simple burnout. It is the mind protecting itself after carrying emotional weight for too long without recovery. This is why emotionally exhausted empaths often become quieter, more selective, and harder to reach. Not because they stopped caring about people completely, but because they finally realized caring too much nearly destroyed them. And the people who benefited most from their endless giving are usually the first ones to complain when boundaries finally appear. That reaction alone reveals painful truths about many relationships. Real love respects limits. Manipulation fears them. This video will uncover those hidden patterns step by step, including the emotional habits that secretly trap empaths in one-sided relationships for years. The emotional guilt, the fear of disappointing others, the pressure to stay soft no matter how badly they are treated. Many empaths are praised for their kindness while silently being emotionally consumed by everyone around them. Few people ask what constant emotional responsibility does to a person over time. Few people notice how dangerous it becomes when someone feels responsible for everyone's emotions except their own. That emotional imbalance eventually creates a breaking point, and when it arrives, the empath no longer responds with emotional speeches or dramatic exits. They simply stop reaching, stop chasing, stop over-explaining. That silence feels cold to people who depended on endless access to them, but to the empath, it finally feels peaceful. And peace changes people. Once someone experiences emotional peace after years of exhaustion, tolerating chaos becomes almost impossible again. That is why many empaths never fully return to who they used to be after reaching emotional burnout. They become wiser, more guarded, more aware of energy, intention, and emotional manipulation. Some people call it coldness, but in reality, it is self-preservation. And throughout this video, you will see exactly how that transformation happens little by little until the empath finally chooses themselves for the first time in a very long time. So stay until the end because the final truth about emotional detachment may completely change how you view kindness, relationships, and even your own emotional exhaustion. If this message already feels personal, there is a reason for that. This channel is for people who notice what others ignore, people who feel deeply, think deeply, and silently carry more than they show. Welcome to the Silent Empath. Subscribe now and become part of a community that understands the emotions most people never talk about. Some people spend their entire lives becoming a safe place for others while never finding a safe place for themselves. That is the hidden reality of many empaths. They become emotional shelters without even realizing it. Friends come to them during breakdowns, family members unload stress onto them. Partners expect endless understanding from them. Even strangers feel comfortable opening up around them because empaths carry a calm energy that makes people feel seen. But while everyone feels lighter after talking to them, the empath quietly becomes heavier inside. That emotional weight builds slowly over time, not in dramatic ways, in silent ways, in small conversations that drain them, in constant emotional responsibility, in always being the one who understands while nobody tries to understand them back. Most empaths are not naturally loud about their pain because they learned very early that their role was to comfort others, not burden others. So they stay quiet about what hurts them. They normalize exhaustion, they smile through disappointment. They forgive people who never apologize properly. They give second chances to people who never deserved the first one. And because they make suffering look calm, people assume they are stronger than they really are. One of the most painful truths about empaths is that many of them become emotionally mature too early in life. They learn to read moods before words are even spoken. They notice tension in voices. They sense emotional distance quickly. They become experts at protecting peace inside unstable environments. While other people learn how to express emotions openly, empaths often learn how to manage everyone else's emotions first. That habit follows them into adulthood. They become the listener in every friendship, the patient one in every argument, the understanding partner in every relationship, the person who says it's okay even when it is not okay at all. Over time, this creates a dangerous pattern because the empath slowly becomes emotionally available to everyone except themselves. Their own feelings get pushed aside again and again until they barely recognize their own emotional needs anymore. Many empaths secretly feel guilty for wanting rest, guilty for setting boundaries, guilty for saying no, guilty for choosing themselves. They feel responsible for keeping people emotionally stable, even when those same people are slowly destroying their peace. That emotional responsibility becomes exhausting because the empath starts carrying problems that were never theirs to solve. They worry about everyone, think about everyone, protect everyone, excuse everyone. Meanwhile, nobody notices how tired they are becoming, and even when someone does notice, the empath usually downplays it. They say they are fine, they say they are just stressed, they keep functioning while emotionally running on empty. That is the dangerous thing about emotional exhaustion. It rarely looks dramatic in the beginning. It looks like patience, it looks like kindness, it looks like loyalty. But underneath all of that is someone slowly abandoning themselves to keep others comfortable. Many empaths confuse being needed with being loved. That confusion changes their entire approach to relationships. They believe if they give enough support, enough understanding, enough forgiveness, people will eventually treat them with the same care. But relationships built only on one person giving eventually become emotionally unbalanced. The empath becomes the emotional provider while everyone else becomes emotionally dependent on them. At first, the empath feels useful, appreciated, important. But eventually, the emotional pressure becomes unbearable because they are constantly giving energy without receiving emotional safety in return. And the sad part is that many people become so used to the empath's kindness that they stop valuing it completely. The support becomes expected. The patience becomes normal. The forgiveness becomes automatic. Nobody realizes how rare that level of emotional care truly is until it disappears. That is why empaths often feel invisible inside relationships. People love what they provide emotionally, but few people stop to ask what it costs them internally. Few people ask how much pain they are suppressing just to keep peace. Few people ask how many nights they spend emotionally overwhelmed after absorbing everyone else's stress all day long. Empaths often replay conversations in their minds for hours. They overanalyze tension. They blame themselves for problems they did not create. They try to fix situations that are impossible to fix because they believe harmony is their responsibility. That constant emotional monitoring drains their nervous system slowly. Some become anxious without understanding why. Some become emotionally numb after years of emotional overload. Others feel exhausted even after resting because emotional burnout affects the body as much as the mind. The empath keeps pouring into people who never pour back. That single pattern destroys more empaths than people realize. They continue giving because they hope loyalty will eventually be returned. They believe patience will eventually be respected. They believe love will eventually be appreciated. But some people become addicted to receiving without ever learning how to give back. And empaths often attract those kinds of people because their kindness feels safe to emotionally selfish individuals. Toxic people are drawn toward emotionally generous people the same way thirsty people are drawn toward water. The empath becomes a source of validation, comfort, support, and emotional healing. But unlike healthy relationships, toxic relationships slowly drain the empath while giving very little in return. And because empaths naturally see potential in people, they stay longer than most people would. They keep hoping for change. They keep remembering the good moments. They keep believing their love can heal behavior that only accountability can fix. That hope keeps them trapped longer than they deserve. One of the hidden psychological truths behind overgiving is that many empaths develop survival habits through emotional adaptation. In unstable emotional environments, pleasing others may have once protected them from rejection, conflict, or emotional abandonment. So they learn to stay agreeable, helpful, understanding, easy to talk to, emotionally available. Those behaviors once helped them survive emotionally difficult situations, but later in life those same survival patterns begin destroying their boundaries. The empath starts believing their value comes from how much they can emotionally provide. That mindset makes rest feel selfish. It makes boundaries feel cruel. It makes emotional distance feel like failure. So they keep overextending themselves until they are emotionally collapsing internally. And because empaths are usually highly self-aware, they notice the imbalance long before they admit it. They feel the emotional distance in relationships. They recognize when effort is one-sided. They sense manipulation quickly. But instead of leaving, they often try harder. They communicate more carefully, love more deeply, forgive more completely. They believe if they become even more understanding, the relationship will heal. But emotional exhaustion grows quietly every single time their effort is not returned. Every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every moment of emotional neglect slowly adds weight onto their nervous system. And unlike anger, emotional exhaustion builds silently. That is why people are shocked when empaths finally disconnect. They mistake silence for sudden change when the truth is that exhaustion had been growing for years. There are moments when the empath sits alone after helping everyone else and suddenly feels empty inside. Not sad, empty, as if all emotional energy has been drained out of them completely. They start realizing they cannot remember the last time someone genuinely asked how they were doing without turning the conversation back to themselves. They realize they are always emotionally available for others while nobody is emotionally available for them. That realization hurts deeply because empaths do not usually ask for much. Most only want honesty, consistency, emotional safety, and mutual effort. But even those simple needs often go ignored because people become so dependent on the empath's giving nature that they stop seeing them as a human being with limits. They start seeing them as emotional support that will always remain available no matter how poorly they are treated. That expectation slowly destroys the empath's inner world. They begin suppressing emotions more often. They avoid conflict to keep peace. They stay silent about disrespect because they fear losing connection. But silence has consequences. Every unspoken hurt remains inside the body. Every ignored feeling becomes emotional pressure. Over time, the empath begins feeling emotionally disconnected from themselves because they spent so long prioritizing everyone else's emotional comfort. This is why many empaths eventually reach a breaking point that even they do not fully understand at first. The emotional exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore anymore. Simple conversations begin feeling draining. Constant emotional responsibility starts feeling unbearable. They stop having energy for fake connections. They stop tolerating emotional inconsistency. Their patience becomes thinner not because they became mean, but because they finally reached their emotional limit. And the strange part is that this shift usually happens quietly. There is no dramatic announcement, no explosion, no revenge, just distance, silence, withdrawal. One day the empath simply stops chasing people who stopped choosing them a long time ago. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop trying to rescue people who refuse to rescue themselves. That shift shocks everyone around them because most people never expected the empath to change. They assumed the kindness would always remain available no matter what happened. But emotional exhaustion changes people deeply. The empath begins noticing how often they were emotionally used while calling it love. They start recognizing how many relationships depended entirely on their willingness to overgive. They begin questioning why they tolerated situations that constantly drained them. And once those questions begin, the emotional transformation becomes impossible to stop. The empath starts valuing peace differently. Silence feels safer than emotional chaos. Distance feels healthier than constant disappointment. They become more selective with energy because they finally understand not everyone deserves unlimited access to them. That realization creates discomfort in people who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries. Suddenly, the empath no longer responds instantly, no longer fixes every emotional crisis, no longer sacrifices sleep, peace, and mental stability for everyone else's comfort. And people notice immediately. Some react with confusion because they genuinely depended on the empath emotionally. Others react with anger because they lost emotional control over someone they took for granted. This is where many empaths face another painful realization. Some people were attached to their usefulness, not to them as a person. The moment the giving stops, the relationship weakens. That truth hurts deeply because empaths love sincerely. They invest emotionally with full loyalty. Discovering that some people only valued what they received from them creates emotional grief that is difficult to describe. But that grief also awakens clarity. The empath begins seeing patterns that were invisible before. They notice how often their feelings were dismissed, how often their needs were minimized, how often they apologized for reacting to pain that others caused. That awareness changes the way they interact with people forever. They stop over-explaining boundaries, stop proving their worth constantly, stop shrinking themselves to make emotionally immature people comfortable. The heart of the empath does not suddenly become cold. It becomes tired, tired of carrying relationships alone, tired of forgiving without change, tired of understanding people who never tried to understand them back. Emotional exhaustion changes the way they speak, think, and connect. They become quieter because they finally realize not every emotion deserves explanation. They become more distant because closeness without reciprocity became too painful. They become calmer because chaos no longer feels normal to them anymore. Some people misunderstand this transformation completely. They call the empaths selfish for finally protecting their peace. They accuse them of changing, but the truth is that the empath was always sacrificing parts of themselves just to maintain emotional harmony. What people call change is often just the empath finally returning to themselves after years of emotional self-abandonment. And the most shocking part comes after the empath stops trying. People suddenly begin noticing everything they once ignored. The missing effort, the missing emotional support, the missing patience, the missing warmth. The emotional energy they once took for granted suddenly becomes absent, and that absence creates panic, because many people never realized how much emotional stability the empath was carrying for them until it disappeared. What happens next shocks people the most because the empath no longer reacts the way they used to. Arguments no longer receive emotional speeches. Disrespect no longer receives endless forgiveness. Emotional manipulation no longer receives understanding. The empath becomes emotionally still in a way that unsettles people deeply, not because they stopped feeling emotions, but because they finally stopped sacrificing themselves to protect everyone else from consequences. That silence feels unfamiliar to people who depended on endless emotional access to them. And the more peaceful the empath becomes, the more uncomfortable toxic people start feeling around them. Because emotionally exhausted empaths eventually develop something powerful that they lacked before. Boundaries, real boundaries, not temporary boundaries built from guilt, strong boundaries built from survival. They begin understanding that protecting their emotional energy is not cruelty, it is necessary. They realize they cannot heal while constantly surrounded by people who drain them emotionally. So they start pulling away from environments, conversations, and relationships that destroy their inner peace. That withdrawal surprises people because empaths usually stay loyal for a very long time. They endure more than most people ever see. So when they finally let go emotionally, it means they have already spent years trying to save the connection internally. Most people only witness the final stage of the empath's exhaustion. They do not see the countless nights of overthinking before it, the emotional breakdowns hidden behind calm behavior, the constant mental battles between staying loyal and protecting peace. By the time the empath disconnects emotionally, they have usually already cried, processed, forgiven, and emotionally mourned the relationship privately many times. That is why their silence feels sudden to others but feels overdue to them. And once the empath reaches that stage, returning to the old version of themselves becomes difficult. They remember too much now. They finally understand how dangerous endless giving can become without boundaries. They understand how easy it is for kind people to become emotionally consumed by others. Most importantly, they understand that love without reciprocity slowly becomes emotional self-destruction. The strange part begins after the empath finally stops overgiving. Not immediately. At first, people barely notice the change because they are so used to the empath always being there. They assume the silence is temporary. They think the distance will disappear in a few days. They believe the empath will eventually return to fixing problems, checking in, comforting everyone, and carrying emotional conversations again. But this time feels different. The replies become shorter, the emotional energy feels missing. The constant effort disappears slowly, and for the first time, people begin experiencing what the empath had been feeling for years: emotional absence. The attention that once came naturally is no longer there. The empath no longer rushes to calm everyone down, no longer sacrifices sleep to fix emotional chaos, no longer drops everything to rescue relationships that were already emotionally draining them, and that sudden change creates reactions nobody expected. Some people become uncomfortable almost instantly because they depended heavily on the empath's emotional availability without even realizing it. The empath was the emotional glue holding many relationships together. They were the listener during breakdowns, the calm voice during conflict, the patient one during emotional storms. Once that energy disappears, the emotional balance inside relationships begins collapsing. Suddenly, conversations feel colder, problems feel heavier, silence feels louder. And people start panicking because they never learned how much emotional labor the empath was carrying for everyone until it stopped. One of the hardest truths about human nature is that people rarely notice your value when you are always available. Constant availability creates emotional blindness. The more dependable the empath becomes, the more people unconsciously assume their effort will never end. Their kindness becomes expected instead of appreciated. Their patience becomes normal instead of respected. Their emotional support becomes taken for granted instead of protected. That is why many people only realize the empath's importance after the withdrawal begins. Absence reveals value faster than presence ever could. Suddenly, people notice the missing messages, the missing emotional warmth, the missing reassurance. And because they are no longer receiving unlimited emotional access, their reactions start exposing who they truly are. Some people become angry first, not because the empath hurt them, but because they lost emotional control over someone who always made them feel emotionally safe. Toxic people often depend on empaths more than empaths realize. They rely on their forgiveness, their understanding, their emotional softness. The empath absorbs tension, excuses bad behavior, and constantly tries to maintain harmony. Once that emotional supply disappears, toxic people feel exposed and emotionally unstable. Some react by blaming the empath. They accuse them of changing, becoming cold, becoming distant. But what they really mean is that the empath stopped tolerating emotional imbalance, and that loss of access frustrates people who benefited from the empath's endless patience. Others react differently. They suddenly become kinder, more attentive, more emotionally available. They send messages asking if everything is okay. They become softer because they feel the empath emotionally slipping away. But the empath notices something important during this stage. Many people only increase effort after they sense they are losing access. That realization hurts deeply because it reveals how invisible the empath's exhaustion was before. Nobody noticed the pain while the empath was still giving. Nobody changed while the empath was still sacrificing themselves quietly. The effort only appeared after the emotional distance became noticeable. That realization changes the empath internally because they finally see how often their kindness was treated like an unlimited resource instead of a human effort with emotional limits. Some people react with confusion rather than anger. They genuinely do not understand why the empath pulled away because they never paid attention to emotional imbalance before. They assumed the relationship was healthy simply because the empath never complained loudly. But silence is dangerous in emotionally one-sided relationships. The empath spent years swallowing pain quietly just to avoid conflict. They tolerated disappointment silently. They accepted emotional neglect silently. They carried relationships silently. So when they finally disconnect emotionally, people mistake it for sudden behavior when it was actually years of emotional exhaustion slowly reaching the surface. This is why the empath's withdrawal feels shocking to others. People only see the final stage. They do not see the years of overthinking before it, the internal emotional battles, the nights spent questioning whether they were asking for too much, the emotional breakdowns hidden behind calm conversations. By the time the empath pulls away emotionally, they have usually already spent months or years trying to save the connection internally. Their silence is not impulsive, it is accumulated exhaustion finally becoming visible. And the more the empath detaches emotionally, the more relationships begin revealing their true foundations. Some relationships grow healthier because mutual respect finally appears. Others collapse completely because the relationship was surviving only through the empath's overgiving. That truth becomes impossible to ignore now. The empath starts noticing how many interactions depended entirely on their willingness to tolerate imbalance. Once the empath stops overextending emotionally, some people lose interest quickly. Conversations become less frequent. Effort disappears. Emotional connection fades, and that reveals one of the most painful realities the empath will ever face. Some people loved access to their energy more than they loved them as a person. That realization changes the empath deeply because empaths love sincerely. When they care about someone, they care completely. They invest emotionally with loyalty, patience, and genuine intention. Discovering that some relationships existed mainly because of what they provided emotionally creates grief that feels heavier than ordinary heartbreak. It feels like emotional betrayal, not because people openly lied, but because the empath slowly realizes the connection was never as mutual as they believed. The moment the giving stopped, the relationship changed. That shift reveals truths the empath spent years avoiding. Suddenly, the people who once demanded constant emotional energy become distant when they are asked for the same effort back. Suddenly, the people who relied on endless understanding become defensive when boundaries appear. Suddenly, the people who expected loyalty disappear once emotional convenience disappears. The empath watches these patterns unfold quietly, and each realization pushes them further toward emotional awakening. At first, the empath feels guilt during this transformation. They worry they are becoming selfish, cold, uncaring, because they spent most of their life connecting love with sacrifice. They believed being a good person meant enduring emotional pain quietly. So when they finally stop overgiving, it feels unfamiliar, even wrong at times. But slowly something changes inside them. For the first time in years, they begin experiencing moments of emotional peace, real peace. The kind that comes from no longer carrying everyone else's emotional chaos constantly. And once they experience that peace, they start understanding how emotionally overwhelmed they truly were all along. The constant stress begins fading. The emotional overthinking decreases. Their mind becomes quieter. Their nervous system feels calmer. And they realize something painful. They were never difficult for wanting emotional balance. They were simply surrounded by people who benefited from their lack of boundaries. That realization becomes the beginning of the empath's silent transformation. The empath starts protecting their peace in ways they never did before. Not loudly, quietly. They become more selective about conversations, more careful with energy, more aware of emotional manipulation. They stop immediately responding to guilt-driven behavior. They stop feeling responsible for fixing everyone's emotional problems. They stop abandoning themselves to maintain relationships that only survive through self-sacrifice. And this new version of the empath confuses people because it feels unfamiliar. The empath is still kind, but the access is different now. The emotional availability has limits. The patience has limits, the forgiveness has conditions, not because the empath became cruel, but because exhaustion taught them what unlimited giving does to the soul. One of the biggest changes happens in the way the empath reacts emotionally. They stop reacting the way toxic people expect them to. Emotional manipulators depend heavily on predictable emotional responses. They expect guilt to work, silence to create panic, blame to create self-doubt. But the emotionally exhausted empath begins responding differently. They become calmer, more emotionally detached from unnecessary conflict. They stop defending themselves endlessly. Stop explaining their intentions repeatedly. Stop trying to force people to understand them. This silence unsettles toxic people deeply because emotional control weakens when emotional reactions disappear. The empath no longer argues to prove their goodness, no longer chases people who constantly create emotional instability, no longer begs for emotional consistency. Instead, they quietly step back and observe behavior clearly for the first time. That emotional distance changes everything. The empath begins seeing manipulation patterns they once ignored. They notice how some people only contact them during emotional crises, how some relationships revolve entirely around the other person's needs, how guilt was used to keep them emotionally available. That awareness becomes impossible to reverse once it fully arrives. The empath starts valuing peace more than emotional attachment, and that shift changes the energy they carry completely. People can feel it even without words. The empath becomes harder to manipulate because they finally understand that protecting emotional energy is not selfish. It is survival. They stop reacting emotionally to every accusation. Stop internalizing everyone else's moods. Stop carrying emotional responsibility for people who refuse accountability. That emotional separation feels uncomfortable at first because empaths spent years emotionally merging themselves with others. But slowly they realize boundaries do not destroy healthy relationships. They expose unhealthy ones. The people who truly care about the empath adjust respectfully. The people who depended on unlimited access react negatively. And that reaction alone reveals everything the empath needs to know. This transformation is not dramatic on the outside. Most people would barely notice it at first. The empath simply becomes quieter, more private, more emotionally protective. They stop explaining every feeling, stop trying to convince people of their intentions, stop emotionally chasing people who already showed inconsistency repeatedly. They become more comfortable walking away from draining situations without creating emotional chaos. That emotional calmness becomes their new strength. The empath no longer feels the need to save people who enjoy drowning in their own destructive behavior. That realization changes their relationships completely. For years, they believed love meant rescuing people constantly, supporting endlessly, understanding endlessly. But now they realize some people do not want healing. They want emotional caretakers who will protect them from consequences forever. The empath finally understands that saving people who refuse growth only destroys the person trying to help. This was not revenge, it was survival. That truth matters deeply because many empaths blame themselves during this phase. They think they became emotionally unavailable when in reality they simply became emotionally healthier. They stopped sacrificing themselves for one-sided relationships. They stopped accepting emotional exhaustion as normal. They stopped confusing suffering with love. And as their inner world becomes calmer, another painful realization begins surfacing. Some people never truly loved them beyond what they provided emotionally. That realization arrives slowly through patterns, through changed behavior, through disappearing effort, through emotional distance that appears the moment the empath stops overgiving. The relationship changes because the emotional supply changed. And that truth cuts deeply into the empath's heart because they always loved people beyond usefulness. They stayed loyal through pain, through mistakes, through emotional chaos. They gave people grace repeatedly because they believed connection mattered more than ego. Realizing that some people only valued the comfort, validation, and emotional support they received creates a level of disappointment that is difficult to describe. The empath begins replaying memories differently now. They notice how often they were present for others during difficult moments while receiving very little emotional support during their own struggles. They notice how conversations constantly returned to other people's problems, how their own feelings were minimized, how their emotional exhaustion was ignored as long as they kept functioning emotionally for everyone else. And suddenly many relationships start making painful sense. The empath realizes that some people never wanted mutual emotional connection. They wanted emotional access, unlimited support. unlimited patience, unlimited understanding. The moment those things became limited, the relationship weakened. That is the hardest truth many empaths ever face. The moment you stopped overgiving, you discovered who was only staying to receive. Some relationships survive this realization because genuine love adapts to boundaries. Genuine care respects emotional limits. But other relationships collapse completely because they were built entirely around the empath's willingness to self-sacrifice. And even though that truth hurts, it also frees the empath emotionally. For the first time, they stop blaming themselves for every failed connection. They stop believing their worth depends on how much pain they can tolerate for others. They stop measuring love through exhaustion. Instead, they begin understanding something life-changing. Healthy love does not require emotional self-destruction. Real connection does not demand constant sacrifice from one person while the other only receives. The empath slowly begins rebuilding their relationship with themselves after years of emotional neglect. They begin listening to their own feelings again, trusting their intuition again, respecting their emotional limits again. And although the transformation feels lonely at times, it also feels honest. For once, they are no longer pretending to be emotionally okay just to keep people comfortable. They are no longer performing endless emotional labor for people who never notice the cost. The empath finally understands that constantly saving everyone else nearly destroyed them. And with that realization comes a new kind of strength, quiet strength, calm strength, the kind that no longer needs validation from emotionally unavailable people. The kind that chooses peace over emotional chaos even when loneliness temporarily follows. Because deep inside, the empath now understands something they ignored for far too long. Losing yourself while trying to keep everyone else emotionally whole is not love. It is slow emotional destruction disguised as kindness. So no, the empath did not suddenly become heartless. They did not wake up one morning and decide to stop caring. What people call coldness was actually exhaustion that had been building quietly for years. Every ignored feeling, every one-sided relationship, every moment they carried emotional pain in silence slowly changed them from the inside. The empath still loves deeply, still cares deeply, but now they finally understand that love should not require destroying yourself to keep others comfortable. They finally realize that constantly sacrificing peace for people who never protected theirs was never kindness. It was self-abandonment. And once an empath understands that truth, they can never fully return to the version of themselves that gave endlessly without limits. They become more careful with their energy, more protective of their peace, more aware of who truly values them and who only values access to them. That change may look distant to some people, but to the empath, it feels like finally breathing after years of emotional drowning. The silence people fear so much is not built from hate, it is built from disappointment, exhaustion, and the painful realization that not everyone who receives love knows how to return it. The empath did not stop loving people, they stopped begging people to love them correctly. And that quiet transformation becomes their greatest form of strength because for the first time, they stop choosing everyone else at the cost of themselves. They stop shrinking their feelings to maintain unhealthy connections. They stop explaining their worth to people determined not to see it. And somewhere in that silence, the empath finally reconnects with the person they lost while trying to save everyone else. If this felt personal, it is because many people watching this have lived through it silently. Many know what it feels like to carry everyone emotionally while pretending to be okay themselves. Many know the exhaustion of always being the strong one, the understanding one, the safe place for everyone else while secretly feeling emotionally alone. And if that is you, then understand this clearly. You are not weak for getting tired. Even the softest hearts have limits. Even the kindest souls eventually break when love is constantly one-sided. You are not the only one who became quieter after giving too much of yourself away. Sometimes distance is not cruelty. Sometimes it is healing. Sometimes silence is the first peaceful thing an exhausted soul has felt in years. So if this message connected with you, stay connected with this channel because these are the conversations most people avoid but deeply need. Like this video if you felt understood. Subscribe for more deep emotional truths that help you see people, relationships, and yourself more clearly. And share this with someone who keeps carrying everyone else while silently falling apart inside. Because some people only understand your value after your silence replaces your presence.